They told you history was written in books, taught in classrooms, preserved in monuments. But they never told you about the stories buried in silence, the ones that live in forgotten valleys where no one dares to look. Tonight I will show you something you were never meant to see, a legacy so twisted, so haunting, that once you hear it, you will never look at family the same way again. In the hollowed mountains of Appalachia, beyond the broken roads of odd West Virginia, there lives a family that became a myth, whispered about but rarely confronted. And at the center of it all is a woman who carried chains heavier than most empires. She is Betty Whittaker, the matriarch of a bloodline bent inward upon itself, a woman who lived not for herself, but for the survival of everyone else. Betty did not choose this life. She was born into it, born into a world without electricity, without running water, without the mercy of schools or doctors. She came into the world in 1952, surrounded by brothers and sisters whose minds were never fully formed, whose voices were not words but barks and cries. She was one of 15 children, the eighth, in a line that seemed less like a family tree and more like a knot of bloodlines looping endlessly together. Her parents, John and Gracie Whitaker, were not only husband and wife, they were double first cousins. The blood in their veins was nearly identical, and so were the burdens passed down to their children, while others broke. Betty held. She was quiet but unshakable. When her brothers wandered barefoot through the mud screaming at shadows, she cleaned them, fed them, calmed them. She learned to translate their grunts into meaning, and in time she became more than just another sister. She became the pillar, the anchor, the one her dying mother whispered to with her final breath, "Never leave them." Betty, and she never did. That command became her life sentence and her life purpose. The Whitakers lived outside the world's notice, hidden in a shack, patched together from scrap wood and rusted metal. 15 children, 2 parents, and silence thicker than smoke. The floors sagged, the winters froze, the summers rotted. But inside that home, Betty's presence was the only light. She carried them from one day to the next. She carried them when the state ignored them, when neighbors whispered, cursed, and recoiled from their door. She carried them when death stole her parents away, leaving only chaos behind. And through it all, Betty did not run. She did not flee. She did not seek freedom. Instead, she surrendered to blood, turned her chains into duty, and became the living heartbeat of a family that otherwise would have collapsed into dust. Betty grew up fast because she had no choice. In Appalachia, the world outside their shack was harsh, but inside it was merciless. Hunger pressed on them like a shadow each winter, and disease was a guest that never left. Children coughed in the night, their small bodies shivering without blankets, and food was never enough. Betty worked every inch of the land, scratching out gardens from the rocky soil, boiling beans until there was nothing left but watery broth. She carried water from a creek half a mile away and washed clothes until her hands cracked and bled. She was just a girl, yet the weight of an entire household already rested on her back. Her brothers were different from the start. Some could barely speak. Some made noises that echoed through the hollow, like animal cries. They ran barefoot in all seasons, their clothes torn, their hair wild. Their eyes darted not like those of children, but like creatures born in the dark. The people of odd West Virginia whispered about them. They called them things never meant for human ears. They laughed from a distance, mocked their sounds, and warned their children never to go near that house. Betty bore the cruelty in silence. She shielded her brothers from the taunts when strangers passed by. She clothed them when their own hands could not button a shirt. She guided them when their minds wandered in endless confusion. She was sister, mother, and protector, all in one. In the dim light of their cabin, she would brush their tangled hair, whisper comfort to calm their cries, and remind them in her own quiet way that they were still human even when the world said otherwise. When her mother, Gracie, grew weak with illness, Betty became her hands and her strength. She cooked, tended the younger children, soothed her mother's fever, and still worked the land. Gracie's final days were filled with fear, not for herself, but for the fragile children she would leave behind on her deathbed. She clutched Betty's arm and with fading breath gave her one command: take care of them all. And Betty swore she would. She swore it with tears, she swore it with blood, and she swore it with every ounce of strength she had left. From that day forward, Betty was no longer just a daughter. She became the matriarch, the center, the one who bore the name Whitaker. Not as a curse, but as a burden she chose to carry, and in doing so she sealed her fate, tied forever to a family the world would never understand. When Gracie Whittaker was gone, the family slipped deeper into shadows, but Betty refused to let them drown. She was only in her early 20s, yet already she wore the face of someone twice her age. The lines of worry etched into her skin spoke of sleepless nights and endless battles. But Betty kept moving because standing still meant death. Her father, John, was still alive, but he too was broken, worn down by poverty, silence, and the crushing weight of a life trapped in bloodlines that never stretched beyond the hills. His health declined, his mind faded, and soon the full burden fell on Betty alone. She became the cook, the caretaker, the one who rose before dawn to fetch water and stayed awake long past midnight to quiet the cries of her siblings. She patched their clothes with scraps of old rags she found behind dumpsters in town. She scavenged cast-off furniture and old mattresses that neighbors threw away. She turned trash into tools because she had no other choice. Betty never asked for help because she knew none would come. The townsfolk of Aud looked at the Whitakers like ghosts, cursed by their own blood. They did not see children. They did not see a family. They saw only a warning of what happens when poverty and inbreeding rot together in the dark. But Betty saw something else. She saw life worth saving. She saw her brothers not as creatures, but as souls bound in fragile cages of broken genetics. She could not free them, but she could protect them, and that was enough. She gave them food when her own stomach went empty. She gave them shelter even when storms ripped through their roof and snow drifted across their floorboards. She gave them herself until nothing of Betty remained except the duty she carried. Over time, death came again. Her father, John, faded into the earth, leaving Betty with no parents, no guide, no one but herself, and the brothers who leaned on her like helpless children. She buried him with her own hands, and when the last stone was laid, she turned back to the shack and walked inside, carrying on as if the world demanded she never pause, never grieve, never collapse. Betty became mother and father, sister and savior, all in one body. Her name was never carved into stone, but in the silence of that shack she was the spine that kept them alive. Years rolled forward, but the Whitaker home remained frozen in a time that the modern world forgot. The shack leaned harder with each storm, the roof sagged like a tired back, and the wooden floors bowed under years of footsteps. But still Betty stayed. Her brothers, now grown in body but not in mind, wandered the dirt yard like restless spirits. Some barked like dogs, some muttered sounds that no outsider could understand. They wore the same tattered clothes season after season, their bare feet blackened by mud and winter frost. Outsiders rarely came, but when they did, the air thickened with fear and cruelty. Strangers brought cameras or cruel curiosity. Some came to gawk, others to mock. Some offered food only to snatch it back with laughter and insults. The Whitakers were called monsters, freaks, even demons, but Betty met every intruder with the same silent strength. She stood at the doorway, eyes steady, shoulders squared, her presence alone, a shield between her brothers and a world that refused to see their humanity when reporters first discovered the family. The images shocked the nation. Photographs of men with twisted features and haunted eyes spread across newspapers and television screens. People demanded answers. How could this happen in America? How could such isolation and genetic entanglement still exist in the late 20th century? But Betty did not care for headlines. She cared only that her brothers were fed, clothed, and safe from the cruelty of strangers. Her duty was not to explain, but to endure. Betty learned to navigate the rare kindness of a few neighbors who left bags of groceries at the edge of the yard without stepping inside. She traded small gestures of trust for survival, always careful to keep the deeper secrets hidden. She knew that one wrong visit from authorities could scatter her family into institutions where they would be prodded and locked away. She would not allow that. As long as Betty breathed, no outsider would separate them. Through bitter winters and scorching summers, Betty carried water, split firewood, and patched leaking roofs. Her back bent, her hands cracked, her hair silvered, but she never faltered. She moved like a force of nature, patient and unstoppable. The hills of Appalachia may have caged her family, but Betty turned that cage into a fortress of love, grim and unyielding, refusing to let the outside world destroy what little life they had left. As the years stretched on, Betty became more than just the heart of the Whitaker family. She became their legend. In odd West Virginia, her name was whispered with a strange mix of pity, fear, and reluctant respect. People who mocked the family in daylight spoke softer when Betty's name was mentioned, because even those who scorned them knew she was different. She was not broken like her brothers, not trapped in the fog of minds that could never fully awaken. She was sharp, steady, unbending, and it was her will alone that kept the Whitakers alive. Betty's life was sacrifice upon sacrifice. She never married, never bore children, never allowed herself the dream of escaping into a world beyond the hills. Her world was four walls patched with tin and wood and the endless cries of her siblings. Yet within that narrow cage she carved out a kind of power. Every day she chose to stay when she could have walked away. Every day she carried their burdens on her shoulders, when the easier path would have been to let the world take them. She turned chains into armor, and in doing so became something greater than most people could ever understand. Outsiders who visited were struck by her silence. Betty rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were clipped and careful. She had no need for chatter because her actions spoke louder. She cooked with precision, scrubbed floors until they shone patched clothes so neatly that neighbors often marveled at her skill. She showed a discipline that belonged to warriors, though her battlefield was nothing more than a shack in the woods, and her soldiers were brothers trapped in the prison of their own blood. Her strength came at a cost. The weight of endless duty bent her back, aged her face, and carved sorrow into her eyes. She was a woman who carried grief like a second skin. She buried not only her parents, but some of her siblings too, each loss tightening the chains of responsibility around her soul. Still she pressed on. She did not cry for herself. She cried only when her brothers cried, and when the tears were done, she rose again and faced another day. Betty Whittaker never asked the world for recognition. She never sought fame, never sought pity. She wanted only to honor her mother's dying words, to live for them all. And in that promise, she found a kind of immortality, one that would survive long after her own body failed. By the time the outside world discovered the Whitakers, the legend of Betty had already been written across decades of sacrifice. Cameras arrived, strangers arrived, voices from faraway places began to speak of odd, as if it were a hidden carnival of broken bloodlines. Yet those who stepped into that sagging house felt something they could not explain. They expected chaos, but instead they found order. Not the order of wealth or beauty, but the order of a woman who had held back the flood with her bare hands. Filmmakers pointed their lenses at her brothers, at their vacant stares, their grunts, their strange movements. But always their eyes drifted to Betty. She did not perform for the camera. She did not beg for sympathy. She simply stood as she had always stood, steady as stone. Her presence carried weight more haunting than any deformity, because she revealed the truth of endurance. She was the one who held the line against collapse, the anchor in a storm no one else could weather. As the world consumed their story, Betty became both guardian and prisoner. She wanted protection for her family, yet every photograph, every video spread their suffering like wildfire. Her brothers became symbols of inbreeding, but she became the silent witness, the woman who refused to abandon them. It was a cruel paradox. She shielded them from shame, only to watch their shame turned into spectacle, and still she endured. Neighbors said she was unshakable, but in quiet moments those who truly watched her saw something else, a heaviness in her walk, a hollowness in her eyes. She was a fortress, yes, but every fortress carries cracks. She had given her youth, her strength, her laughter to a house that devoured all three. She had sacrificed love, freedom, and the chance at her own life so that the Whitakers could cling to theirs. Yet even in that sacrifice, she carved out dignity for them all. Without her, they would have been swept into institutions, scattered to the winds, forgotten as nameless cases in dusty files. With her they remained together, bound by blood, bound by care. She gave them a strange kind of wholeness that no outsider could understand. In the shadows of history, Betty Whittaker became something larger than tragedy. She became proof that even in the darkest corners of collapse, one's soul can stand unyielding. One's soul can defy the abyss. The story of Timmy Whitaker is not just about one man, but about the echoes of generations stacked upon each other until the weight crushed the living. What we see in his silence, what we feel in his vacant stares, is not emptiness but inheritance. Every grunt, every shuffle of his feet, every moment of stillness carries the ghosts of choices made long before he was born. The land itself in odd West Virginia seems to hold its breath when his name is spoken, as if even the hills remember. Timmy did not choose to become a symbol. He did not choose to live as the face of collapse. He is not evil, not cursed, not a monster. He is a mirror that forces us to confront the truth of what isolation, poverty, and hidden shame can create. A mirror that reflects back the hidden corners of our own history. Because the Whitakers are not just a family. They are a warning. For decades, the world ignored them. The government never came. The doctors never came. The teachers barely came. What was left was only family bound by ties that grew too close to break. In that silence, in that forgetting, grew something the world now struggles to look at. The Whitakers became both human and myth, feared and pitied, mocked and studied, and Timmy, standing at the center of it all, remained what he had always been, a man trapped between life and symbol. But here lies the darkest truth. The Whitakers are not unique. There are others hidden in the folds of forgotten towns, others whose bloodlines have curled inward under the weight of time and neglect. Theirs is simply the story that surfaced, the one we could not look away from. And if we listen closely, it whispers something far more dangerous. It tells us that collapse does not begin with monsters. It begins with silence, with turning away, with refusing to see. So when you hear the name Timmy Whittaker, do not hear only tragedy. Hear the echo of generations. Hear the warning of what happens when a family is left to wither in isolation. Hear the silence that speaks louder than words. For in his quiet, in his stillness, Timmy has told us more than most ever could. That history is never gone, that blood remembers. that some legacies do not die. They linger in the shadows, waiting for us to finally face them.